Hey y'all, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am coming to you with my Victober wrap up. I know, sad to say that my favorite month of the year is already over, but it was a really great Victober for me. I did go out of town basically the last 2 weeks of the month, and so I apologize that I didn't respond to everyone's comments. I basically just had time to kind of like the comment and move on, so I apologize for that. And it also meant that I kind of missed a lot of Victober content, so I'm excited because that means I have a lot to catch up on. But it also means that I kind of fell off in terms of reading anything in the second half of the month. So I think I have 6 books here, which is respectable because a couple of them were very long. I did not stick to my TBR whatsoever, but that's life. So let's go on and get into this. The first book that I read for Victober this year was Antonina by Wilkie Collins. Because I dedicated an entire themed reading vlog to this book, I don't feel like I need to discuss it at length here, but this was Wilkie Collins's first published novel. It is historical fiction about the fall of the Western Roman Empire. And it is a book of his that you don't hear very much about. In fact, I don't know that I would have heard of this at all had I not looked him up right when I first got into him and I saw that this was the first book of his. This is very different for him as an author, and I think it means that it's possibly not going to work for many regular fans of his, let's say. If you're already into historical fiction and you like Wilkie Collins, I think this is a great one. But if you're really like into him for the mystery, thriller, kind of sensation novel aspect, this book is not going to hit the same way for you, but I thought the characterization was really strong here. I thought his language was really strong, and I find that to be true in every Wilkie Collins book. So this was a delight to me, but it is a book that I feel like I'm going to struggle recommending because throughout the process of reading it, I constantly was wondering to myself like what the purpose of the book was and who the intended audience for the book was. Sometimes you're reading a book and you can tell it's intended for a certain type of person. I had no idea who Antonina was intended for other than maybe me. It did reach an audience. It was just 150 years too late. I'm sorry, Wilkie. But I think maybe also it was just something that he wrote for himself. Sometimes you're reading a book and you can tell it was a passion project for the author and it was just something that they wanted to do for themselves. And I think Antonina really had that quality to it. And so I really enjoyed it. But I do think it is a book that I would struggle to recommend. Next, I read Uncle Silas, which was on my Victober TBR, and I am so glad I got to this one because I feel like through this book, I have found a new favorite Victorian author. I really hope that's true. I instantly downloaded several more of Sheridan Fanu's books after reading this one, and so I'm really excited about that. And I think actually this is one of the few years where I really feel the momentum to carry Victober into November and into the end of the year, and so I'm really excited about that. I think that's in large part due to this book, which is just genuinely fantastic. This is a Gothic novel, and it's very atmospheric, and it felt like a really great book to read around Halloween. It was a perfect autumnal read on top of being a perfect Victober read for me, and I just found the writing so charming. There were some really beautiful passages in here, which I have to say I didn't really expect, and so I just thoroughly enjoyed this reading experience. This was the second book that I picked up, and I automatically felt like Antonina and Uncle Silas just really charged my Victober up, and I really knew that I was going to enjoy it this year from those 2 reading experiences. Both of these books got 4 stars from me. Part of me wants to give Uncle Silas 5 stars, but I had some major issues with how our main character Maud acted, and at certain points it felt to me like maybe he, as the author, didn't know how to set up conflict without making her act foolishly, and that is just one of my big pet peeves in reading. I don't like to read characters that have to be inane and stupid just for the sake of the plot, and that's what this felt like to me. It reached a certain point in the book where I just really wanted things over with. And in particular, I didn't really care if something bad happened to our main character, Maud, because she literally would not listen to anybody around her. And that just became a pet peeve of mine. But I think that also says something positive for the reading experience and for the book in general, because I had such a visceral reaction to the characterization and the plot in it. And whether that's positive or negative, I always want to award a book based on that. The real reason that I didn't rate this one 5 stars is that there's so much in dialect in it, and that is so hard for me as a reader to read. And I know a lot of people really like it, but for me, it's a real struggle to read. And so I felt like that slowed me down. And I also felt like I was missing pertinent bits of information during those sections where people were speaking in dialect. But all in all, I would have to say, I think this is my most successful read of Victober. I think it is the one that I feel the most positively towards, and I think it's also the one that I feel like I could recommend the most often of the ones that I read. I really loved this, and so I hope that I have found through this experience a new favorite Victorian author. The past few years, I have read a nonfiction book, a Victorian nonfiction in Victober, and that's been really enjoyable to me. And so this year, I decided to read Mornings in Florence by John Ruskin, because I discovered John Ruskin last year. And I was so excited about him when I first discovered him. And so I knew I wanted to read one of his books this Victober, and I was going to Florence. So it seemed pretty pertinent to me to read an art critic's work on Florence, and that's basically what this is. The thing about this book is, though, it's intended as a guidebook. And I think really the benefit that you would get from this is just so much more if you were reading it while you were there looking at the art pieces. And I think that's the way John Ruskin intended you to read this book. Like, this was the ideal for the Victorian traveler. You would have this book with you while you were in Santa Maria Novella and you were looking at the Giotto and Ghirlandaio frescoes. You would have this with you when you went to Santa Croce and saw the other Giotto frescoes. And so there's a lot of description in this that kind of is lost on you if you were not also looking at the art piece that he is describing. And I really found this odd because it didn't seem to me like he intentionally wanted to close in on that kind of turning point between medieval and Renaissance art, but that's certainly what the focus of this book was. The focus of this book was nearly entirely on Giotto and Giotto's generation in the late 1300s after Giotto. And I personally found that really interesting because I don't think that time period gets enough attention, and I think there is some stunning artwork you can see in Florence, and it's often artwork that nobody else is looking at, weirdly enough, because they know the bigs. And a lot of people go to Florence for the big Renaissance names, but the early Renaissance is very, very interesting. And so I was excited that he decided to show attention to that, but this was also very short. And I know his other works are really, really long. I personally just really loved his writing so much. And I think for me, what I also really enjoyed about this was kind of getting a peek into the Victorian traveler's mindset and how he viewed art versus how we view it in the modern day and how we discuss it. That was of interest to me. And I really found that genuinely fascinating. And I also found it interesting to kind of put myself in the headspace of a Victorian traveler. Like, you, as a Victorian traveler, you might have seen this art piece maybe in a magazine or in a newspaper. Like, you very well may have seen an image of it in the Victorian period, certainly, but you've never seen it in color, and you have never seen it in HD, let's say. Like, most of us now, we travel and we know what we want to see because we've looked it up online, or we've seen a film that is set in the place that we're going. And so we kind of have an idea of what something is going to look like long before we get there. And I found it so genuinely interesting to think about seeing this art piece for the first time and having no context for it other than this guidebook. Like, now we can go and look at something and I'm like, oh wow, I have no idea who that is. Let me look that up, and I can Google who the artist is and I can learn everything about them in 15 minutes while looking at the art piece. The Victorian traveler doesn't have that luxury. And they also didn't have the luxury of like quick travel time. So he discussed reading his works on like the day-long journey. It would take you on the train to get from Florence to Rome. That was stunning to me because I actually thought it would be faster. You can now get between Florence and Rome in about an hour and a half. I know it's on a fast train, but it still wouldn't take you a day, even on just like a regular regional train. And so this was just interesting to like put yourself back in time and think about being a Victorian person, like going on holiday and seeing these things for the first time. And I just thought it was interesting that he chose to elevate art pieces that maybe aren't as talked about today. And that leads me into another question, like, was he talking about what was truly famous and remarkable to the Victorian audience? And we just now don't talk very much about Giotto or his contemporaries? Or was he, even at the time, shining a light on an artist we don't discuss enough? I don't know. I really enjoyed his writing. I'll definitely read more from him. I rated this 4 stars because the writing was so beautiful, but I do think the experience would have been improved upon by reading it when there. And I also think there could have been more meat to it. I was looking for a little bit more. This felt very, very short to me. Next, I really went rogue and I read something called The Necromancer, which was a penny dreadful. And this was a roller coaster ride in terms of the plot of the book and also in terms of my emotions while reading it, because this book is so awfully long. Like, it doesn't need to be as long as it is. Let's go on and get that out of the way. But I do think there's merit to the fact that it is so long. Like, I did reach a point where I thought the length was justified. And so this is a penny dreadful. And in the Victorian period, your penny dreadful was kind of a cheap dime novel. Like here in the States, we had the dime novels, which were most famously Westerns. Penny dreadfuls were famously kind of ghost stories and gothic tales that were very, very gory. The Necromancer is written by George Reynolds, who was one of the most famous penny dreadful writers, and he wrote Wagner the Werewolf, which is the one that I really wanted to try. I knew that this year I wanted to try a penny dreadful, but the tagline of this is what got me, because this is about women that have been disappearing for centuries. And it's all linked to this same family, why these women have been disappearing. And throughout the book, you meet members of these different families and they come together to figure out what's going on. And it's set in Henry VIII's England. So it's also a period piece. It's also historical fiction. It is just so wordy and I can't defend it, honestly. Like, I did reach a point where I just truly was loving the book and I did rate it 4 stars, but it cannot be defended in terms of its length. And he would never use a sentence where he could put a paragraph. He must have been paid by the word, because it genuinely was so verbose that it actually took me out of the reading experience quite a few times. But the story was so interesting and engaging. The thing about it is, I don't know that I would have noticed the length so much had it not been so repetitive. Like, so much time was spent on telling the story of each individual girl that had gone missing in the Middle Ages. And once you have read one of those stories, you know how the other women were taken and you know what happened to them after you have read one story, because it happened the same way every single time. But we had to hear it 5 times over. That's what got old to me. And that is where I kind of thought the meat of the story, like that's where I thought some editing needed to have been done. But weirdly enough, those are kind of the most engaging aspects of the story. Like, you get another period piece within this piece of historical fiction, and you get to travel to a different location. Like, one of the girls is Italian, one of the girls is French. And I just thought it was really wonderful and fairy tale like. This really felt nostalgic to me, and I think that's why I gave it 4 stars instead of 3, because no doubt there are some flaws here that really need to be dealt with, and it certainly needed to be edited down. But that's kind of the nature of the penny dreadful, and that's kind of also just in general the nature of a serialized book to me. But I really felt like this is something that I would have enjoyed as a teenager. There was something in it that felt very reminiscent of Van Helsing, okay, the movie with Hugh Jackman. It felt like that, or like even like the 2004 King Arthur. I feel like I'm dating myself here, but 2003, 2004 was some great time for film. And also the Grimm Brothers movie with Heath Ledger and Matt Damon. There were shades of that in this. And so this to me felt very nostalgic, and I just really wound up enjoying it. But I think this, like Antonina, is a book that I would have a very hard time recommending. I think its audience is out there, and I am encouraged by this experience because this most certainly is not his most famous Penny Dreadful. I'm encouraged by this experience to read more from this author, but I love a supernatural story, and like this book literally opened with a skeletal hand coming out of the closet. It doesn't get any better than that. I mean, it really does not. So I was really excited to read truly a Victorian horror story or ghost story here at Halloween, and this really gave me what I wanted. I then read the group read this month, which was The Mayor of Casterbridge by Thomas Hardy. I adored this. I rated this 4 stars, and now that my feelings have kind of settled on it, I think 4 stars is really what it deserves. This was good, but looking back, I don't feel like this reached the heights of some of my favorite Thomas Hardy novels. It's weird to say this about a Thomas Hardy novel, but parts of this were kind of heartwarming to me, and I kind of just felt good reading it. And definitely there were some sad parts in this because it is Thomas Hardy. But I felt like the good outweighed the bad and outweighed the depression in this one. And I really just truly enjoyed the characterization here. Our main character, the mayor of Casterbridge, to me, that's possibly the strongest characterization I have ever seen from Thomas Hardy. He was such an enjoyable character to read about because he did a lot of reflection on things in his past. And he really did try to make up for wrongs that he had done to other people, mistakes he had made. It was genuinely a character redemption that I believed in and that I found believable. Like, I actually thought this was something that could conceivably take place in real life. And that's something that I have to say in general for Thomas Hardy. His stuff may be out there in terms of plot, and you may say this is just not believable, but to me, how his characters act are true to real life, or like literally how somebody would react in that situation. Whether the situation is believable or not, I feel like the characters are, and that was no exception here. And I really enjoyed it. I think it's going to rank kind of in the middle for me with Thomas Hardy. It was really, really good. And so I'm always encouraged by that. I felt like the last couple of things I've tried from Thomas Hardy, I've not enjoyed. So I really needed a win. I'm really glad that I picked this one up this year because I really wanted something to renew my relationship with him and make me excited about him again, and that's definitely what this book did. Last but not least, I want to talk about my favorite book that I have been reading for Victober this year. I am still in the middle of this because this thing has to be over 2,000 pages, and it's another Penny Dreadful. That is Varney the Vampire. Okay. I'm going to rate this book 5 stars. I'm over 60% of the way through this. I feel like I'm over 1,000 pages into this beast. I am going to rate this book 5 stars. Is it too long? Maybe. Does it make sense? Maybe not. Do I care? No. I am having the time of my life reading this. This is easily the best reading experience that I have had all year. I have never had this much fun. Because this is a Penny Dreadful, it's also really long and it was serialized over years. And so plot lines just drop off. Like, one character was a big deal in the first 30 chapters, literally the brother of one of the main characters. And now, like, over halfway through, he has never been mentioned again by name. And so there are a lot of things like that, like little mini plot threads have been dropped. Somebody got killed, but it was off page and they've never been mentioned again. And I am just thoroughly enjoying it. You know, at this point, I guess I know what the book is, and it's not trying to be serious literature. Penny Dreadfuls were just things that you picked up to read here and there, I guess. And probably by default, they were meant to be enjoyable if you missed one of the serialized parts. So you could pick this up at any moment and still kind of know what's going on. But I personally think there is something very deep and introspective here, though the plots are going everywhere, though the characters have changed characterization time and again. To me, the vampire character, Varney, he's genuinely one of my favorite vampires I have ever read. And he makes this book so lush and wonderful to read. This is maybe not the first instance of a gentleman vampire. That was probably Polidori's Vampire of 1818. But I think this is definitely the first instance of a vampire who hates himself. And Varney does not outright hate himself the way that kind of the modern vampires hate themselves. He's not a Louis from Interview with the Vampire or a Stefan from the Vampire Diaries. It's like an internal thing with him. And occasionally we get a chapter from his perspective. And it's like his mindset is just so genuinely fascinating. I really rarely read modern vampire books that hit on this topic so well, which is that somebody is old and has lived a very long time. And Varney feels old on the page, and he feels like a beleaguered old man sometimes when we're getting an internal monologue from him. It is so wonderful to read because he also feels like somebody who has lived a life, not just somebody who's old. Like a lot of times, again, we read modern vampire fiction and it's a vampire that's lived in this town for 150 years. Varney has traveled and he's done everything in his life. And like, there are parts of it where he kind of feels like, I've done everything on this earth there is to do. So what should I do now? And I just really love it. And he proposed to this girl in the book. And it was one of the most romantic proposals I have ever read in my life. Of course, she rejected him because he's a vampire, because this is the Victorian period. But then he automatically like switched gears and he was like, well, then I have to kill you. And that is when I knew 5 stars. Something just happened in this book where one of the main characters betrayed everybody else and has been working with Varney the whole time. It was a genuine shock to me. I literally did not see it coming. For me, the makings of a good vampire story should always deal with age, history, and it should also deal with attraction. And I think this has really taken those elements and run with them. The themes are so interesting. There's so much to discuss about this book. I mean, honestly, I'll probably do an individual review when I finally finish it because I am blown away by this. This was just like popcorn fiction, let's say. Like, this is the James Patterson of the Victorian period, you know? And this is really making me think, like, I could analyze this. I wish I was back in school so that I could write a paper about what this book is discussing. Yes, there are flaws. Yes, it is too long, but I just am having the time of my life reading it. Again, I feel like this is a book that I would struggle to recommend to somebody based on how long it is. But I think if you're looking for an iconic vampire story, this one really hits that, and it hits it very early on. And I am shocked beyond all that we are not discussing this more. Why are we talking about Dracula? Why are we talking about Polidori when we could be talking about this? I'm in love with this. I'm obsessed with this. And I kind of want to drag it out because I don't want it to end. I'm just having so much fun. So this is my last read for Victober, but I know in my heart I'm giving this 5 stars. So it was a great Victober for me. I didn't get to many books on my TBR, and I really didn't get to many that were mainstream, which I'm kind of happy about. I always fear every year with Victober that I'm running out of things to read, and so I'm trying to save books by popular authors for later years. And this year proved to me that some of the books that we don't talk about as often can be just as great as the authors and the most famous classics that we talk about all the time. And so this has been a really encouraging year for me. And like I said, I feel like I want to let Victober spill over into November and December this year, and maybe I will. I would love to know down below how your Victober went, and I would love to know if you read any of these. But that's going to be all for me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Goodbye.